This is the Truth Network.
Coming to you from an entrenched barricade deep in the heart of central North Carolina. Masculine Journey After Hours. A time to go deeper and be more transparent on the topic covered on this week's broadcast. So sit back and join us on this adventure. The Masculine Journey After Hours starts here now.
Welcome to After Hours. Today is unexpected change. We're going to go deeper and get more personal and hopefully show how Jesus ends up allowing these things in our life in order that we can get a better look at the person that he wants to work with. And I love what you said as we were getting ready for this show, Darren, that his desire is so much for that relationship between you and him. He's ready and willing and able to take away your kids, your wife, your job, your health, your whatever it takes.
Well, so the context was I was explaining to a friend of mine a book that I will literally say probably saved my life, and it was a book called Shattered Dreams by Larry Crabb, and so I would highly recommend that.
It is awesome. He recommended it to me when my dreams were shattered, and I read it.
And so the whole point is God is willing to shatter your dreams. The reason being that he knows your heart better than you do. He knows what's really in there, that deepest, darkest spot in your heart where the brightest kernel is, okay? It may be down in there. It may be in a tiny piece with all the shards that have been broken in your heart, but he knows that it's there, and he knows what it is, and he knows you better than you do. And so he is willing to take away anything that gets between you and that thing. Well, for me, that thing was having a real relationship with him. He knew that's what I wanted more than anything in life. My addictions were looking for comfort, looking for acceptance, looking for some way to not be rejected, looking to prove that I was man enough, whatever. All of those different things, as having been a child who was sexually abused by two older male family members that were not in my direct immediate family. But anyway, those two guys didn't even really know each other very well. And but both of them were pretty broken guys, obviously, and both of them sexually abused me at different points in times. And so I began to have a scar of my own that sounded something like the common denominator is you. You know, these two guys don't even know each other, so you must be the problem. And so Satan had put that scar on me, and I wore it. And so most of my life, my pose, my risk-taking, my prowess to date every girl I possibly could, all of that was in view of trying to hide that scar, that, you know, there's something wrong with you. And so it wasn't until I finally figured out that God was willing to take everything that I worshiped instead of him, or that I used as a comforter instead of him, or that I used as an excuse instead of a relationship with him. He was willing to take any of those things and all of those things. He didn't yank them all out at once most of the time, but for me, I'm kind of a thick-headed idiot. And so it did come to a point in time in my life where he did yank a lot all at the same time, and it almost killed me, literally. And but through that experience, that unexpected change began to happen, and it's still happening, thankfully, much better ways.
Right. As we talked about, Peter, had all this change. We talked about this in the broadcast. Like, oh my goodness, he's sitting there that night. Here come the Romans. Everything completely changes overnight. He actually gave the guy quite a scar on his head, they lost the ear.
Yeah.
But don't think that
a lot of knife work going on in
Peter
this
didn't
show.
have a scar. However, there was the beach breakfast, that that restoration and the intimacy between Peter And Jesus, when he was forgiven, is something that you can't. But there was a scar, and so we have a wonderful clip, right, Rodney?
Oh, it's got a scar.
Yeah. So go for it.
Well, there's the movie called Inglourious Basterds, and there's a big change right at the end of the movie that you just don't expect, because this is a movie that's set in World War II, and the characters on the American side are dropped in behind enemy lines in France, and their whole mission is just to kill Nazis. And it's a fictitious movie, but what comes to is they end up capturing a bunch of Germans in a theater, and Hitler happens to show up at the last second. They even get him in there, and they kill all these German leaders. And they did this with the help of one of the German colonels, played by Christoph Waltz. His name is Hans Land. And this officer gives up his own people so that he can be saved. He's done all these bad things. He was kind of known as the Jew hunter. That was his name in the movie. And then he becomes this ruthless killer, and then next thing you know, he's going to get off scot-free. He's going to head over to Nantucket. He's going to have a nice little cozy cottage house, live out the good life in the United States, because he made a deal with the German or with the U.S. Generals. Well, the guy who was actually in charge on the ground and was actually taken prisoner, they're doing this end of the movie scene where they swap roles, and now the German guy is going to become the prisoner of the U.S., and he's made this deal that he get off, and he made a deal for his buddy who gets shot. You'll hear him get shot, and then Brad Pitt decides, you're going to have a permanent scar by the swastika on your forehead, and that's what you'll hear the screams at the very end.
Herman, uncuff them. I'm officially surrendering myself over to you, Lieutenant Rain. We're your prisoners.
How about my knife? Thank you very much, Colonel. Udovich cuffed Colonel's hands behind his back.
Oh, is that really necessary?
I'm a slave to appearances. Scalp Herman.
Are you mad? What have you done? I made a deal with you, General, for that man's life!
Yeah, they made that deal, but they don't give about him. They need you.
You'll be shot for this?
Nah, I don't think so. More like chewed out. I've been chewed out before. You know, Udovich myself heard that deal you made with the brass. In the war tonight, I'll make that deal. How about you, Udovich? You make that deal?
I'd make that deal.
I don't blame you. Good deal. And that pretty little nest you feather for yourself. Well, if you're willing to barbecue the whole high command, I suppose that's worth certain considerations. But I do have one question. When you get to your little place on Nantucket Island, I imagine you won't take off that handsome-looking SS uniform of yours. Ain't you? That's what I thought. Now that I can't abide. How about you, Udovich? Can you abide it?
Not one bit, sir.
I mean, if I had my way, you'd wear that uniform for the rest of your life. But I'm aware it ain't practical. I mean, at some point, you gotta have to take it off. So, I'm gonna give you a little something you can't take off. I think this just might be my masterpiece.
Yeah, that was a swastika that was being carved into that man's head, and if you watch the movie, you get to see that. Whatever, full 3D, whatever you want to, But the interesting thing about our scars is I have been thinking about this, like, oh my goodness, Andy Honeycutt is a good friend of the ministries. He's in the studio with us, and the last time I saw Andy that I remember was at a marriage retreat. And at that marriage retreat, I had recently, Jesus had come in to work with my addiction to pornography. However, and that's a fairly long story. I had a pretty good scar that went with it, but I'd been hiding those scars for years and years. And as soon as Jesus helped me work through all that needed to be done, breaking agreements, all these things I was doing as a result of an incident that happened with sexual abuse in my life early on, he was like, you need to tell your wife. You need to show her the scar.
She didn't want to know.
She didn't want to know. And I really didn't want to tell her because many times she'd told me, like, if she would hear about, we saw the movie Fireproof together. You can imagine.
Yeah, that was a real knee slapper to go to with your wife if you're a
and if I ever
porn
found
addict.
out you were doing something like that, I would divorce you. And I would never put up with somebody who would do that. And I heard all these things, and I was completely convinced it would be the end of my marriage. But God said, no, when the time comes, you've got to tell her. So those who are familiar with our boot camps, we have this thing called a covenant of silence. Well, I don't know what rocket scientist came up with this idea of a joint covenant of silence, but I think it might be this gentleman sitting next to me. We're at this marriage retreat.
I'm not that smart. It was probably the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. And they're like, okay, we want to have a joint covenant of silence. And on this one, we want you to take to God something that you've never told your mate. Now, this is like, couldn't be a week, and it might have been 4 or 5 days after this incident between me and Jesus. And all of a sudden, here I am at a marriage retreat with a covenant of silence. I've got to go tell her something that I've never, ever dreamed would ever happen. And talk about a broken heart. Now it's me inflicting.
That's what it feels like.
Oh, it was. It was like, and oh, by the way, that swastika is still on my forehead every time my wife looks at me, and I know it is. However, and this is a gigantic however, and don't try this at home unless you have a whole lot of prayer going on, I'm just saying. But oh my goodness, to actually be forgiven for the person you really are, to actually be loved.
So when she tells you now, Robbie Dillmore, you're a good man, I love you.
Right.
Can you hear it better than you could hear it when you were living a lie?
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, there's no comparison to the intimacy, because before I always knew that she didn't know the real one, so there's no that. But if you think that she doesn't still catch me in stupid, human tricks all the time, but it awakens something up in me that every time that happens, I went, and wow, I left the toilet seat up, or whatever. She still loves me. But, there's like, wow. It's a beautiful thing that Jesus knows all that stuff, but you got to get real with him. And a lot of times he throws all this change in our lives so that we can get a look at it. Right, Jim?
Yes, he does. And it's, I was so happy when you took the microphone away from me and shoved it back over to Rodney, because I've been thinking of a few things in my life, and it almost gets back to my name. James is a form of Yaakov, the deceiver, the supplanter. I was such a good liar, such a good poser.
I've noticed
that very few have caught me in it, except you guys that know me well. And it occurred to me with that clip that there's a lot of freedom in having that swastika carved on your head, and you sort of intimated that a minute ago. I mean, I was a rescuer. I wanted to save everybody from everything. And two of those all ended up in at least emotional affairs with Proverbs 7 women that I was trying to help. And now I am in a position where I'm helping a guy that's the same guy I was back then. And I want to slap him and say, you idiot, get over it. You don't want anything to do with her. And, His is so much like mine because he hasn't had any physical kind. They've held hands, I think. But that level of intimacy is so much more wounding for a wife than if you had sex. It didn't mean anything. And I didn't know that then. But it's broken up his marriage, and he is fighting, pursuing her, and he's at the point where nothing, that's his focus. And one of the things that came up tonight, and I told him 2 days ago, that God is in the business of tearing down idols. And an idol is anything we put before the relationship we have with Him. Mm-hmm. And, one of mine, being a rescuer sounds like a good thing. It's terrible. He's the only rescuer that can be in our lives.
I've been I read a book a few years ago called Pendulum, and it's a great book. It's about the 80-year swing that we see in our society. We're coming to the end of a me cycle, an 80-year me cycle. In 2023, and we're going into a full-fledged we cycle, and it's really cool, and it's backed up by biblical history. You can read through the scriptures and see this happening. Awesome book. But one of the things that the author said the other day with regard to that is that we often, like in the early 80s, the whole world was idolizing posers, okay? Michael Jackson, poser. The Village People, posers. Kiss, posers. All of these people that make up their life way outside of the bounds, right? And so we're now moving to the more authentic style of music that people like and that sort of thing. But this whole idea that God is in the business of tearing down idols. But one of the things that he talks about in this is that it's not necessarily between one bad thing and one good thing. That the definition of duality is two good things, justice and mercy, but you can only choose one. So sometimes you have to choose justice over mercy or mercy over justice. And God's the only one that can totally deal with justice and mercy simultaneously. We as human beings struggle with that. And so we have this duality in our life. Is it a bad thing to help somebody, to try to rescue somebody? No, it's not. But what's the better thing? And so choosing better over best, is hard for us as human beings. And so we get struggling as we do that, and Satan comes along and helps us interpret the things that we see in life, rescuing someone. Do I give good counsel to others, but I don't take it myself? Do I devote most of my energy in helping others? Is that outside of my family, or is that with my own children or my wife? Neither one of those are bad things, but you can often get put in a situation where God has to redirect us. And often this change that we're talking about is not necessarily because we're in some horrible sin. It could be that we're just not prepared or capable of handling best over better or better over best.
And we don't trust Him to give us the best. We know what's best. God doesn't. That's been my biggest falls.
Morgan, with Ransom Heart, we're going to have him
Morgan
on here
Schneider,
in a couple with his new book, Becoming a King.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a story. It's in the audiobook. I don't think it's in the other book, but about a man that was huge in ministry and well known throughout the world for this unbelievable ministry. And he had a funeral, and his son was there, and he says to some of his friends, he said, "Wow, that sounded like a great man. That was really all those people speaking at his funeral. He sounded like a great man, but that wasn't the dad I knew."
Mm-hmm.
And there you have it.
Mm-hmm.
There you have it with your own kids. Like, right? You're the Christian car guy. You talk about, road rage or whatever. But, my own kids often hold up the mirror and they're like, Dad, I'll never forget one time I got kicked out of a basketball game that my son was in.
That's happened to you too?
Yeah. And, yeah. He can preach a good message, right? But does his life measure up to that message? And, are you willing to let the people in your life reflect back to you that which God's trying to get your attention? And, that the legends are, remember the time Dad got kicked out of the, remember they all have this stuff, right? That's actually precious. It's very humiliating, and it's a big swastika on my forehead, but it's extremely precious. That I still have my kids around, at least close enough to tell me, what a poser I am.
Or were. I'm not saying you don't pose about things today. It's just that you posed better then. So, well, so unexpected change, what do we do with it? How do we handle it? That would be kind of my question is, so honestly, when this major change happened in my life, I wanted to give up. I wanted to quit. I gave up ministry. The church that I was ministering at the time said, "Oh no, you can continue to be our minister." And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" I knew me well enough to know, and they meant well. They were sweet people. But I believe if I had accepted that would have been falling into Satan's hands yet again, because you have to keep up the pose. And so there was the freedom of, I'm not a pastor. I'm not a minister anymore. I'm just Darren now, and I could be real with people. It's so hard to watch younger men that I do life with, and I see the pose, in my grandson and in some of my son's friends and different people and all of the younger men that are in my life. And you see the pose, and though, all of us are pretty old guys here in the room, none of us are, like spring chickens. And so it comes out so much easier now that we can see, oh, okay, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So he's trying to pose. So we can give a guy grace in that situation. And I say all that to say this: I think that God is that same way with us. He knows, okay, Darren's kicking and screaming. Yeah, he's a 3-year-old right now. He just wants his popsicle back. But how am I going to, in grace and mercy and justice, mixing all three of those things together, how am I going to help him through this? So how do we respond? I think I know how God does, but what do we got for people listening?
So, Rodney, back to you. Your topic. God, he rocked your world one time. And I think that the answer's inside of that story.
Well, when, I grew up in going to church, I thought I was a believer in Jesus Christ and was going to heaven and all this kind of good stuff. But then as I finally had somebody actually that understood Scripture teach me Scripture, and it happened to be Dr. J. Vernon McGee through his radio program, and I'm just like, listen to this guy, the very first time I ever had on the radio, just for a half an hour show. And I'm like, oh, that was so good. How do I get him back on? Where do I find him again? He's on at 5:30 in the morning on my drive to work, and I'm driving from Winston to Charlotte. I'm like, this is the only time. How can I find this guy, And so
before the days of podcasts and streaming.
Yeah, and this is, I think it was already out there. I just didn't know about it and didn't know how to go get it. And I'm like, so I'm listening, and I'm only listening basically on Monday mornings when I'm driving down there for work. I think there was a few days where I was driving early on all the way, but then I had a place to stay down there, so I'd only drive down early in the morning. And then finally on one of the shows, they talked about, oh, you can listen to us on the podcast, and here's our website and all that. I'm like, oh, I go there and I can listen, I can get it on the phone, and then I'm like listening every day as I'm driving. And, it's just this hunger and thirst comes that I didn't know I had. I had no idea. I was not searching after God. I was not going after him, not trying to get closer. And the next thing you know, my chain's been jerked and the collar was tightened and I was choked, and it was like, oh my gosh, that's what I need to breathe. I need that breath of life. And it was just a big change. And it's, like you say, some of the poses are coming off. There's still a lot of them there because he hasn't been as cruel to me as he has been to you, Darren, thankfully. But they're getting exposed here and there, and enough of them are coming off where it's like, I am actively working to try to find them, take them off. And that's where getting that prepared me to hear the masculine journey message, because I was listening to the radio, and then I was like, I've got to go to one of these boot camps, find out what actually goes on there. Because I hear the stuff on the radio, and it gets you a little bit.
A good bit of cult activity.
Yeah. You get a little cultish, and I really want to get full cultish, So I go to the boot camp not knowing really what to expect, and then you find out, okay, there is biblical principles and things of this nature there, and there's this other sense of these movie themes and all this other stuff, but it's just the way the whole story comes together, and it starts to tie in something that you as a man can go in and try to work through. You'll find that you're connected at one point to certain messages and not to others, and then those will drift off. You may get connected to another one because something else comes up in your life, and it just the ways God's working.
Get your heart back.
Yes.
Become a wholehearted man. That's what he's after. As you push harder into that, as you begin to feel it, it's like, oh my goodness, it's worth the pain, it's worth the scars, it's worth all those things. And it's coming up July 16th through the 19th. Go to masculinejourney.org and register today.